When Della Marsh finally whispered that the burn on her arm had not been an accident, the entire five-star restaurant turned away from her at once. Some lowered their eyes to their wine. Others wiped down a table that was already spotless. All of them had silently agreed on one thing. No one had seen anything at all. For 21 days, the single mother carried every tray with a hand that could no longer straighten, serving the very people who had destroyed her life, because a single mother does not have the luxury of falling apart. But that night, at a table tucked away in the shadows, a man whose name the whole city of Halloran lowered their voices to speak watched in silence. And from nothing more than the way her trembling hand could not grip the tray, he read every word of the lie the entire city was trying to bury. If Della's story has touched your heart, please press the like button to give us more strength to keep telling stories like this. Don't forget to share this video with those who need to be reminded that a person's dignity never depends on whether they're rich or poor. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any deeply emotional stories coming next. Della Marsh's life, before that burn took everything from her, had never been easy to begin with. She was 27 years old, and for the past 2 years, she had carried everything alone. Her husband, a gentle and hard-working laborer, had died after an accident at a construction site on an autumn afternoon, leaving her with a little daughter, a thick stack of bills, and a promise of a better life that he never had the chance to keep. Della didn't have time to fall apart, because every morning when she opened her eyes, there was a clear, innocent pair of eyes looking at her, waiting for her to make breakfast, waiting for her to braid her hair, waiting for her to smile as though the world were still whole. She worked as a waitress at the Ashbourne, one of the most elegant restaurants in the city of Halloran, where a guest's dinner cost as much as half a month's wages for the person carrying it to the table. She was the kind of person everyone liked, but few truly noticed. The woman who remembered the names of regular customers, remembered who liked coffee without sugar, and who was allergic to nuts. In a world where people measured human worth by the money they spent, Della still treated everyone the same, and that was the only part of herself she had managed to keep untouched. The small apartment she and her daughter rented sat inside an old, worn-down building that, bitterly enough, also belonged to the Brandt Family Corporation, though at the time she didn't yet know how that would become the chain binding her life. But on those rare weekend mornings, when she had time off, her life still had light, and that light was named Posy. The little girl was 6 years old, with golden curls bright as early morning sunlight, always carrying a crumpled sketchbook and a box of crayons missing a few colors. That morning, the smell of butter and sugar drifted through the cramped kitchen, so warm and fragrant that it almost made a person forget the air outside had begun to turn cold. Della scattered flour across the table, and mother and daughter shaped cookies together, the weekend ritual they both looked forward to through every long week of work and school. Posy always claimed the job of sprinkling sugar, and every time, she sprinkled far too much, leaving sugar scattered all across the floor. But Della never scolded her. She only laughed, watching her daughter carefully mold crooked little shapes that the child stubbornly insisted were stars and hearts. "Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to open a really big bakery," the little girl announced, both cheeks dusted with white flour, her voice firm as though that future were already resting safely in the palm of her tiny hand. "A really big bakery, with glass windows, yellow lights, and it'll always smell just like this." Della paused, wiped the streak of flour from the tip of her daughter's nose, and felt a warmth rise inside her so tender it nearly choked her. "Then you'll have to save a place for me in that bakery," she said. "I'll be the first person to taste every batch you make." Posy cried out with delight, her eyes shining. "You promise, Mommy? You have to be the first one to taste them." Della placed her hand over her heart, making a solemn gesture as though she were swearing the most sacred oath in the world. "I promise," she said. "I promise with my whole heart." That was the small dream Della had hidden deep inside herself for many years. A dream so simple that she almost felt ashamed whenever she thought of it. Someday, she would have a bakery of her own. She wouldn't have to stand serving tables in someone else's restaurant anymore. She would make things with her own hands that made people smile instead of bowing her head. That dream was like a tiny candle she quietly shielded from the wind, afraid that just one strong gust would be enough to blow it out. She held Posy in her arms, breathing in the scent of flour and sunlight in her daughter's hair, and in that moment, she believed that as long as she had the child, she could endure anything. She couldn't have known that only a few days later, these very hands, the hands kneading dough, the hands holding her daughter close, would become the thing people would cruelly steal from her. There were certain names that people in the city of Halloran never said out loud. In taverns hidden behind dark alleys, in card games that never appeared in the newspapers, they called him simply Mr. Vance, and that alone was enough to make the air in the room turn thick and heavy. No one knew exactly what Garrett Vance controlled. They only knew that when a street once crawling with loan sharks suddenly went strangely quiet, or when some neighborhood thug who made a habit of bullying the poor abruptly vanished without leaving a trace, somewhere behind it all, his hand was there. That night, inside an abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district, where only a weak yellow light fell across the cold cement floor, Garrett sat on an old wooden chair, his coat draped loosely over his shoulder, his calm eyes fixed on the man trembling in front of him. The man's name was Royce, a small link in the network Garrett had built, a man who had just been caught using the organization's money to force a poor working family to pay brutal interest, even threatening the husband who lay bedridden with illness. Garrett didn't shout. He had never needed to shout, because his true weight lived inside his silence, a silence that made the men standing before him feel a chill crawl up their spines more sharply than any roar ever could. "I have one rule," he said, his voice low and steady, like water moving quietly beneath a thick sheet of ice. "Do you know what that rule is?" Royce swallowed hard, his lips moving without shaping a single word, his large hands clenching and unclenching without his knowing it. "The rule is," Garrett continued, still without raising his voice, "we never touch people who've already got nothing left to lose. This city is crawling with strong men who make a living preying on the weak, and I don't intend to raise another animal like that inside my own house." He stood up slowly, and that simple movement alone was enough to make Royce take a step back and stumble against the wooden crate behind him. Garrett walked forward and placed one hand on the man's shoulder, a gesture that looked almost gentle, almost friendly. But it drove the bigger man, a man taller than him by a full head, down onto his knees on the floor, sweat breaking across his forehead despite the bitter cold of the harbor night. "You'll return every single dollar to that family," he said, each word falling clear and solid, along with a decent apology. "After that, you'll disappear from my city before sunrise. I'm giving you the chance to leave on your own 2 feet, Royce. Don't make me change my mind." The man nodded frantically, stammering his thanks, then scrambled up and rushed out of the warehouse like an animal that had just escaped the jaws of a trap. Garrett watched his shadow fade away, his face showing not the slightest trace of emotion. People still said he was a ruthless man, and they weren't wrong, not at all. But his ruthlessness always had a clear direction, and it had never turned its sharp edge downward toward the people standing at the bottom of this society. Because once, a very long time ago, he too had stood at that bottom, a skinny boy carrying dishes in a diner to earn every coin he could for his sick mother, tasting every kind of contempt from those who believed they had the right to trample others, simply because they were poorer. He had never forgotten that feeling, the feeling of being looked straight through as though he didn't exist at all. And perhaps that was why he spent the rest of his life hunting the people who made others feel that way. When he stepped out of the warehouse and got into the car waiting for him, he had no idea that the man he had been chasing for 20 years was finally about to expose a small opening, and that opening would come in the shape of a woman with a bandaged arm. In the car gliding smoothly away from the harbor district, Garrett's driver and right-hand man, a quiet and loyal man named Dove, handed him a thin file clipped neatly together. "Just as you predicted," Dove said, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "Calvin Brandt. I've been digging for months, but everything is clean on paper. Transparent taxes, regular charity donations, photographs of him shaking hands with one councilman after another, one councilwoman after another. On the surface, he's a model citizen of this city, without a single opening for us to slip a hand into." Garrett turned the pages of the file beneath the passing sweep of streetlights flashing across the window glass, and when his eyes stopped on Calvin Brandt's portrait, an older man with silver hair, a falsely kind face, and the smile of someone who had never had to pay for anything at all, a muscle in Garrett's jaw gave the slightest twitch, the only reaction he allowed himself to show. 20 years, he said softly, almost whispering only to himself. "A man like him can't stay clean for 20 years, Dove. He's just better at hiding it than the others. The filth is always there, beneath the glossy coat of paint. The only problem is that we haven't scraped the right place yet." Dove glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a trace of hesitation passing through his eyes. "Are you sure you want to keep pursuing this?" he asked. "Brandt isn't the kind of man we can handle neatly in a warehouse like tonight. Touch him, and you touch an entire tangled web of power." Garrett didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out the object he had carried with him for so many years, an old pocket watch with a tarnished, scratched silver case and a thin crack across one corner of the glass. He opened the lid and looked inside, where the hands had stopped moving long ago, frozen at some moment in the past that only he knew. "I don't intend to handle him in a warehouse," he said, his voice sinking lower. "I want this entire city to see him fall, from the height where he stands, falling in front of every person who ever bowed their head before his money. But to do that, I need something he can't buy with cash. I need an opening, a real crack. One person he's trampled on who dares to stand back up." Dove stayed silent for a while, then asked in a careful voice, as though touching an old wound, "Your mother, isn't it? All of this, after all these years, is still because of her." Garrett closed the watch with a soft click, and in that moment, his usually cold face showed a distant pain that had been buried for far too long. "She once worked for a wealthy owner," he said slowly, each word seeming carefully weighed. "In a laundry workshop 20 years ago. She worked herself to the bone from before dawn until late at night, her hands soaked in hot water and chemicals until they cracked and bled, just to earn me a meal and a decent place to sleep. Then one day she fell ill because of that very work, and the owner to whom she had given her health cast her aside without a shred of mercy, throwing her into the street the way people throw away a rag once it has no use left. She died before I was old enough to protect her. This watch is the only thing she left me." He closed his fist around it, his knuckles turning white. "I swore beside her that one day, the man who caused it would have to pay. And I always keep my promises, Dove. Always." While Garrett sat with his mother's watch clenched tightly in his palm, not far away, beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Ashbourne restaurant, Della Marsh was fighting her way through every passing minute of her shift. Her right arm was wrapped in thick bandages all the way to the elbow, and every time she had to lift a tray, the bandage rubbed against the unhealed wound underneath, sending a sharp pain through her as if hundreds of needles were piercing her flesh at once, then spreading all the way up to her shoulder blade. She had learned how to press a groan down into the bottom of her throat. She had learned how to keep a server's smile on her lips while tears threatened to spill from the sting. Worse than the pain itself was the helplessness of that arm, because her elbow could no longer straighten, and every morning when she woke, she had to spend a long while using her one good hand to bend each curled finger back until they would agree to move. She had grown used to carrying everything with only one hand, used to bending her body in strange ways to hide the clumsiness she had never asked for, used to the quick glances from her co-workers before they hurriedly looked away. That evening, a regular customer, the wife of a local gallery owner, stopped by the counter to sign her bill. She looked Della over, her brows drawing together into a worried crease. "Good heavens, Della, you look terribly pale," she said, her voice carrying a trace of genuine concern. "What happened to your arm, child? Why is it wrapped up so tightly like that?" Della froze for a moment. For the past 3 weeks, she had kept silent. She had buried the truth deep inside her heart. But that night, perhaps because she was too exhausted, because the wound was throbbing with a faint fever beneath the skin, a fragment of the truth slipped from her lips before she could stop it. My arm won't straighten anymore, ma'am," she said softly, her voice trembling. "The burn won't heal. I think it's infected inside. And the truth is, it wasn't because I spilled water on myself like people said. She stopped suddenly, biting down hard on her lip, swallowing the rest of the words back into her throat when she realized she had said too much. The woman went rigid all at once, as if she had touched an invisible current. Her eyes flicked quickly toward the closed door of the private room reserved for important guests, where the Brandt family often spent their evenings, and then her face immediately changed, turning cool, closed off, and distant. "Now, dear," she lowered her voice until it was almost only enough for the two of them to hear. "I heard people say you unfortunately slipped and knocked over a whole pot of boiling broth in the kitchen. That was just a regrettable workplace accident. Nothing more. Everyone makes mistakes on the job sometimes. The restaurant's private doctor has already examined you, hasn't he? Then you should rest easy and take care of yourself so you can recover quickly. Don't go troubling your mind with strange thoughts. In a place like this, child, there are certain things best left untouched. Stirring them up will only bring suffering down on your own head." With that, she hurriedly finished signing the bill, snapped her wallet shut, and walked away with quick steps the sound of her high heels tapping across the marble floor growing farther and farther until it disappeared, leaving Della standing alone beside the counter. She lowered her head and looked down at her bandaged arm, and a cold, wounded loneliness rose inside her chest until it nearly choked her. They all knew, she thought. The manager knew. That paid doctor knew. The woman just now had probably guessed more than a little. All of them knew the truth clearly. But not one of them dared or wanted to admit it, because the Brandt name cast its shadow over this entire place so heavily that it sealed both the mouths and the consciences of everyone here. And she was only one woman, standing all alone. It all began 3 weeks earlier, on a night when the restaurant closed later than usual. Tyr Brandt, the spoiled son of the corporation's owner, was hosting a private party in the room reserved for important guests with his rich friends. Tyr was 31 years old, handsome and rotten in exactly the way a man becomes when he has never had to bear the consequences of anything he's done, a man raised to believe that his father's money could buy everything, including people. He called Della in to serve the table personally, and amid the mocking laughter of his half-drunk friends, he began throwing out crude, shameless remarks, then grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer, demanding that she sit beside him and entertain the whole table. Della gently but firmly withdrew her hand. She politely replied that she still had work to do, and asked to continue her duties, her voice calm, her back straight, preserving the full dignity of a human being, even while wearing a server's uniform. It was that very way of refusing him, proper and full of self-respect, right in front of his friends, that made Tyr feel humiliated. And to a man like him, humiliation was a sin that could never be forgiven. "Some worthless little waitress dares refuse me in front of my friends," he muttered, the smile still sitting on his lips, though his eyes had darkened with the anger of a wounded ego. When Della turned to carry a tray of hot soup toward the door, Tyr suddenly sprang to his feet, pretending to stagger drunkenly, and with one deliberate motion, he struck her hard at the elbow. All Della could remember after that was a terrible, scalding heat crashing down over her right arm, a scream tearing out of her throat that she couldn't hold back, and then she collapsed to the floor in gut-wrenching pain, while Tyr and his friends simply stood there, watching with eyes so indifferent they made the blood run cold. "Oh, how clumsy," he said in a mocking tone, then calmly stepped over her curled-up body on the floor, leaving behind one cold sentence: "Clean this up, then go home." She was taken down to the restaurant's medical room, but when the corporation's private doctor, a man named Pell, stepped inside to examine her, Calvin Brandt was already standing there, waiting. A thick envelope was quietly placed on the table, and after only a few brief words exchanged between them, the official diagnosis was written into the record in one neat line, stating that the employee had caused her own accident through carelessness while working. "Listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Calvin leaned down and whispered into her ear, his voice so gentle that it was more frightening than shouting. "You slipped. You knocked over the pot of water yourself. That is everything that happened tonight, and that is how it will remain forever. If you dare breathe a single word saying otherwise, you'll lose your job immediately, and you know very well who owns the apartment you and your daughter are renting. You have a little girl, don't you? Such a lovely child. Think about her future before you decide to do anything foolish." Her daughter's name, spoken so lightly from the mouth of her enemy, felt to Della as cold and sharp as a blade pressed against her throat. She nodded through her tears. She swallowed every ounce of bitterness back down inside herself, and trembling, she signed her name on that cruel, wrongful paper. Then the very next morning, she put on her apron and returned to work, carrying trays of food for the very people who had destroyed her life, because a single mother never has the luxury of being allowed to collapse. And yet, it wasn't true that no one had seen the truth and wanted to stand on her side. About a week after that fateful night, a young assistant cook named Marlowe quietly pulled Della into a hidden corner behind the kitchen, where the noise of pots, pans, and the exhaust fan was loud enough to swallow their conversation. Marlowe was only 22 years old, thin, with a face that still carried something scholarly and unspoiled, and bright eyes that life hadn't yet hardened. He spoke in a low voice, filled with restrained anger, saying he had seen the whole thing through the gap in the door of the private room that night, that he knew perfectly well it hadn't been an accident at all the way they had staged it, and that he was willing to testify for her if she decided to report everything to the police. Della looked at that young man, and for one brief moment, a fragile thread of hope rose inside her like weak sunlight piercing through a gray day. But then that hope went out as quickly as it had appeared. "How old are you, Marlowe?" she asked, her voice gentle and heavy. He answered that he was 22. Do you have anyone you have to worry about? Anyone you have to support? She asked again. Marlowe shook his head. But I do, Della said, her voice catching deep in her throat. I have a little daughter. If I speak out, they'll fire me immediately. They'll take back the apartment where my daughter and I are staying. And think about it. What can the testimony of an assistant cook do against the entire Brandt family? They have the best lawyers, money that never runs dry, and connections reaching deep into the courts. And me, what do I have in my hands? I can't recklessly gamble with my child's entire future. Please, Marlowe, I'm begging you, don't say anything at all. For me and for my little girl. Marlowe stood there in silence for a long while, his face showing both helplessness and genuine compassion. At last, he nodded, because he understood. He understood the trapped position of a mother who had no choice left except to lower her head. But before he turned back to his work, he pressed something into her uninjured palm, a photograph printed from his phone. The image was a little blurred, but still clear enough to show the moment Tyr was springing to his feet right behind Della, only one instant before disaster came down on her. It was a small, faint piece of proof, but even so, it was still real proof. Keep it, Marlowe whispered, his eyes steady. Just in case you ever change your mind. Some things aren't kept so we can use them right away, you know. They're kept for the day when we finally have enough courage to use them. Della took the photograph, her hand trembling. That night, after she returned to the small apartment and tucked the blanket around Posey as the child slept deeply, she quietly opened her old wallet and hid the photograph inside the lining, carefully placing it just beneath her daughter's picture, as though asking the child's own smile to guard that secret for her. She told herself that she would never have to use it, that she would bury everything and keep living in silence for the rest of her life. But she was wrong, because life sometimes has turns no one can see coming, and the day when she would need that courage was far closer than she imagined. Garrett Vance stepped into the Ashbourne restaurant that evening not to have dinner at all. He had come because, through his sources, he knew Calvin Brandt would be there to entertain a group of business partners, and he wanted to observe his enemy with his own eyes inside the very luxurious world where the man reigned. He wanted to find the opening he hadn't been able to trace for 20 years. He chose a table hidden in a dark corner, ordered a glass of wine he barely touched, and sat there in silence like a predator concealed in shadow, his cold, sharp eyes following every movement Calvin made at the large table in the distance. But then, instead of staying fixed on his enemy as he had intended, his gaze kept being drawn toward one server. He realized at once that something was wrong with that woman, because he himself, during the poor years of his 16-year-old life, had once done this same serving work to support his mother, and he knew by heart the posture, the turning rhythm, the way a healthy server shifted her weight. This woman was entirely different. She carried the tray with only her left hand, while her right arm remained almost motionless, the elbow stiffly bent at a deeply unnatural angle, as if it had forgotten how to straighten. Each time she was forced to use her right hand even slightly, her face tightened for the briefest instant, a wince she had painfully trained herself to hide, but still couldn't slip past his eyes. He noticed the edge of white bandage showing beneath her sleeve. He noticed the way she leaned faintly to one side, as if her whole body were bracing itself to protect a wound. And he noticed the thing this entire glittering restaurant was deliberately trying not to see, that this woman was enduring pain, that she was feverish, and that she was forcing herself to survive 1 minute after another. When she passed his table to clear an empty glass, Garrett spoke softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "How long have you been hurt?" Della stopped short, her whole body going rigid for a moment. She had grown so used to being ignored that such a direct question left her bewildered. "Sir, I only slipped and spilled some water," she answered by reflex, repeating the exact lie she had memorized. "It's nothing serious, sir." Garrett slowly turned the glass in his hand, not looking directly at her but at some distant point, as though he were speaking of something obvious that anyone should know. "Hot water falling from above would burn the back of the hand and the outside of the forearm," he said slowly. "But your burn," he let his eyes move briefly toward her bandaged arm, "is on the inside. It wraps around, almost as if someone threw it straight at you. A person can't spill water on herself in that pattern, miss." Della felt heat rush into her face, and her good hand began to tremble. This strange man, in only a few sentences, had seen through the truth she had hidden for 3 weeks, the truth this whole city had joined together to deny. "I'm sorry, sir. I still have work to do, she said quickly, almost like a plea to escape, then turned and hurried away, leaving the tray trembling in her hand. Garrett watched her go, and something inside him shifted slightly. He had come here to find Calvin Brandt's opening, and now he suddenly understood that the woman with the bandaged arm might very well be the path leading him to his enemy, a thin thread that, if followed carefully, could unravel the whole coil. Garrett didn't leave the restaurant right after that. He patiently sat and waited until closing time, waited until Calvin Brandt and his group of business partners got into their cars and drove away amid cheerful laughter and conversation. Then he quietly went to the narrow alley behind the restaurant, where the employees usually left after their shifts. When Della stepped out, pulling up the collar of her thin coat against the late-night cold, her walk heavy with exhaustion, she startled and stopped short when she saw the shadow of the man from earlier, leaning against the brick wall. "I'm not trying to frighten you," Garrett spoke first, his voice calm, and he kept just enough distance so she wouldn't feel threatened. "I only want to tell you one thing, then I'll leave. The wound on your arm is infected. I can see the fever on your face. If you keep ignoring it for a few more days, you may lose that arm forever, maybe even more than that." Della clutched her injured arm tightly, as if by instinct to protect herself. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice guarded. "Why do you care about what happens to me?" "I'm someone who can recognize a lie the moment I hear it," he answered, then stepped a little closer, letting the yellow light fall across his hard, steady face. "And I can also recognize fear when I see it in someone's eyes. What are you so afraid of, that you'd rather lose your own arm than tell the truth?" Della opened her mouth, meaning to repeat the familiar lie one more time, but this time, somehow, the words caught in her throat and refused to come out. Everything she had silently carried for the past 3 weeks, the endless pain, the fever tormenting her, the numbing loneliness, the averted eyes of everyone around her, all of it suddenly came crashing down at once, and the wall she had worked so hard to build around her pain finally shattered. She broke down crying, a sobbing, exhausted cry, the cry of someone who had held herself together for far too long and no longer had the strength to hold on any longer. "My arm won't straighten anymore," she said through her sobs. And this time it was no longer a fragment of truth swallowed back down as before, but everything buried inside her pouring out. "Every morning when I wake up, I have to use my other hand to bend each of my fingers straight. I can't even hold a crayon anymore to draw with my daughter. I hurt so badly I can't sleep. I have a fever. I'm scared. And the worst part is that no one in this world will look at me. All of them look right through me like I'm only a ghost, like my pain doesn't exist. I begged this whole city to listen to me, but all I got back was silence." Garrett stood quietly and listened, and something in his chest tightened. He had witnessed every shape of cruelty life could produce, but the cruelty of people who believed themselves decent, people who chose to turn their faces away and see nothing, always disgusted him more than even the most open kind of evil. He didn't offer her any hollow words of pity. He only quietly held out his hand toward her. "Come with me," he said. "Right now. I can't." "Mr. Brandt will," Della stammered. "I don't care who Brandt is," he cut her off, his voice dropping lower, cold and firm. "You're coming with me to see a real doctor tonight. As for the Brandt family, let me deal with that. You've been fighting alone for too long." Della looked at the hand held out in front of her, then looked up at the face of that strange man, and for the first time in so long, she felt something she had thought she had lost long ago. It wasn't salvation. It was simply the feeling of being truly seen by another human being. She hesitated for a moment, thinking of Posey, thinking of fear, thinking of everything she might lose, and then she made the decision herself. Softly, she placed her trembling hand into his palm. Garrett took Della to the private clinic of a doctor he trusted, a man accustomed to keeping his mouth shut and never asking unnecessary questions. Under the white lights of the examination room, when the old bandage was carefully removed, even the seasoned doctor couldn't help but frown slightly. He examined her for a long time, with great care, then looked up at Della with eyes that were both stern and sorrowful. "The wound has infected deep inside," he said. "How long have you been enduring this? 3 weeks? Good God. Do you have any idea how reckless that was? If you'd left it for only a few more days, this infection could absolutely have spread, and you could have permanently lost the ability to move this arm, not to mention consequences far more dangerous to your life. The fact that you've held on until now, that you've still been going to work every day in this condition, honestly, is almost unthinkable. Della only lowered her head in silence, because she knew better than anyone the price she had paid for every single day she had managed to keep going. Garrett stood quietly in a corner of the room, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. And as he listened to the doctor's diagnosis, something that seemed to have been asleep inside him for a very long time suddenly stirred awake. He looked at Della's hands, the calloused, wounded hands of a working woman, and in that moment, he suddenly saw another pair of hands layered over them. His mother's hands from long ago, cracked and bleeding from being soaked too long in hot water and chemicals in that miserable laundry workshop. Hands that had worked themselves into exhaustion only to be cast aside like an object that had lost all value. He tightened his grip around the old watch in his coat pocket, feeling the cold silver case beneath his fingertips, and an ancient pain he had thought the years had made numb began to ache again, deep and dull. When he had stepped into the restaurant that night, this woman had been nothing more to him than a thread, a path, a means for him to find the opening in Calvin Brandt he had been searching for, or so he had told himself. But now, standing in this room, watching that woman grit her teeth through every wave of pain while still trying to hold on to the last of her dignity, he realized that she wasn't a path, she wasn't a means, but a human being struggling in the current of life, just as his mother once had. A human being the whole world had turned its back on, and his first cold thought, the intention of seeing her as a piece in his game of revenge, suddenly became contemptible even in his own eyes. He had come here because of hatred, but now he stayed for something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. The doctor prescribed medication and gave careful instructions on how to care for the wound, saying that she needed complete rest, a quiet and clean place to recover, and that she absolutely couldn't keep working under the same conditions as before. When the two of them stepped out of the clinic, the night outside had grown very late. Della hesitantly said that she needed to go home to her daughter. Garrett looked at her, and this time, his voice no longer carried the cold calculation it had at the beginning, but something far warmer and more unwavering. "Then we'll go pick her up," he said. "Both you and your daughter, starting tonight. We'll go somewhere no one can touch you anymore. I promise you that." The place Garrett brought mother and daughter to was a quiet house, standing apart on a hillside outside the city, a place the Brandt name couldn't possibly reach. On that first night there, for the first time after so many weeks lost in pain and fear, Della slept through the night, a deep sleep untouched by stabbing aches or nightmares of that fateful evening. She woke when the sun was already high, and for a moment, she almost couldn't believe she'd been allowed to rest so peacefully. The days that followed passed in a kind of calm Della thought she had forgotten how to taste. The wound on her arm, with steady and proper care, began to heal little by little. The fever slowly faded, and the fingers that had once curled stiffly inward could move with more ease each day. But the greatest miracle wasn't in the wound of the body. It was in the way Posey, her daughter, found her bright, ringing laughter again. The little girl quickly discovered the house's spacious kitchen, and one morning, Della found her standing on a small stool, both hands dusted with flour, happily kneading dough beside an older woman who helped around the house. "Mommy, I'm learning how to make cookies," the child cried out when she saw her mother, her face glowing. She asked me what shape I wanted to make, and I said I wanted to make a really big heart for Uncle Garrett. Della laughed, a light, relieved laugh she hadn't had in a very long time. In the evenings, after Posey had fallen asleep, Della and Garrett often sat together in the quiet of the house, and little by little, pieces of their pasts began to open. "My husband died 2 years ago, in a construction site accident," Della said, her voice lowering. "He was a good man, always dreaming of a better life for the three of us. He used to say that one day we'd have a small house with a yard, and I'd open a bakery of my own. But then he was gone, leaving me with Posey and a mountain of worries. I learned not to let myself fall apart, because my little girl needed me." Garrett listened in silence, then softly told her about his own life, something he had almost never told anyone. "I grew up with only my mother," he said, his eyes looking far away. "She worked herself past exhaustion to raise me, doing the hardest jobs anyone could imagine, and her hands were never whole. She died when I was still too young, too small to protect her. Maybe that's why, for the rest of my life, I couldn't stand seeing someone powerless, being crushed by someone strong. That is the one thing I never forgive." Della looked at him, and she began to understand that behind the cold, frightening exterior, the whole city feared, was a man who had once endured losses carved deep into him, a man whose private rules had been forged from his own pain. Two people with two different wounds, one who had lost a husband, one who had lost a mother, and yet somehow they found in each other a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. During those rare, peaceful days, neither Della nor Garrett knew that outside, a storm was silently drawing near, and that this peace was only a brief stillness before the real tempest came crashing down. While Della and Posey slowly recovered in the peace of the house on the hill, Garrett began quietly putting his plan into motion, and he did it not with fists or threats of violence, but with the most powerful weapon he possessed, the weight of his own name. He understood clearly that to bring down a man like Calvin Brandt, he needed solid evidence from the very people who had witnessed the truth, not a swift purge carried out in the dark. The first person he set his sights on was Hewitt, the restaurant manager, the man who had closed his eyes, looked the other way, and helped cover everything up. Garrett didn't need to meet him in person. He only needed a phone call. When Hewitt picked up and heard a low voice on the other end identify itself as Vance, the manager, who had always been so arrogant toward the staff, suddenly went pale, the hand holding the phone trembling uncontrollably. "I know what happened in that private room that night," Garrett said, his voice even and cold as ice. "The only question now is, when everything comes apart, do you want to stand with the people telling the truth, or do you want to sink with the Brandt family's ship? You have one night to think very carefully." On the other end of the line, there was only the sound of hurried breathing, and Garrett knew the seed of fear had been planted. Next came Dr. Pell, the man who had sold his conscience and his signature in exchange for an envelope. Garrett had someone deliver a brief message to him, along with a copy of the very falsified medical record he had signed. And that alone was enough to shake the once confident doctor down to his roots, because he understood that the paper was no longer a protective charm. It had become a noose hanging over his own neck. But the most important piece Garrett needed lay with someone else. From what Della had told him, he learned of the existence of a young assistant cook named Marlowe, the one who had seen the entire incident with his own eyes through the crack in the door. Garrett personally had someone find the young man. When Marlowe was brought to meet him, he was cautious and frightened at first, but Garrett spoke to him with rare directness. "I know you once wanted to help her, but she refused because she was afraid for her daughter," he said. "Now she's safe, and this time, she won't have to face the Brandt family alone. I need your testimony, Marlowe, but I won't force you. I'll only ask you one thing. Are you willing to do the right thing you wanted to do from the very beginning?" Marlowe looked at the man before him, and this time, there was no hopeless fear as there had been before, but a belief that at last, someone had enough strength to protect those who dared to tell the truth. He nodded and agreed, ready to testify when the time came. Once he had gathered all the necessary pieces, from Marlowe's testimony, to the wavering of Pell and Hewitt, to the documents his people had quietly dug up, Garrett didn't pass judgment with his own hands. Instead, he had the entire file delivered to a federal agent he had known for a long time, a righteous man he trusted. Because Garrett understood that the most fitting punishment for a man like Calvin Brandt, a man who had always hidden behind a legal mask, wasn't darkness, but the light of justice exposing him before the entire city. This time, disaster didn't come from the Brandt family, but from a place no one could have expected. One night, when the whole house had already sunk into sleep, Della suddenly startled awake at the strange, restless movements of her daughter. She placed a hand on Posey's forehead and was shaken to realize that the child's skin was burning with a terrifying heat. Her small face flushed red, her breathing quick and heavy. The fever had come suddenly in the middle of the night, fiercer than any ordinary childhood sickness the little girl had ever had. Della hurried to wipe her daughter down with a warm cloth, trying to bring the fever down with everything a mother could do. But the child's temperature refused to fall, and Posey began to grow limp in her mother's arms, her eyes dull and no longer clear. Della's heart tightened with the deepest kind of fear, the most primitive fear of a mother watching her small child weaken while she herself was helpless. "I have to take her to the hospital right now," she said, her voice trembling but firm, without a second of hesitation. She didn't think about the danger that appearing at a hospital might expose where she was. She didn't think about the Brandt family or anything else, because in that moment, inside her heart, there was only one thing left, and that was saving her daughter at any cost. Garrett, hearing the noise, woke up and immediately understood what was happening. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't bring up calculations about safety or the risks that might follow. He only looked at the panicked face of the mother and the delirious child, then said shortly, "Let's go. I'll drive." He lifted Posey into his steady arms with the greatest gentleness, carefully, as though he were holding the most precious thing in the world, then quickly brought both mother and daughter to the car. All along the road, as they rushed through the night, Della sat in the back seat, holding her daughter tightly against her chest, whispering comfort into the child's ear again and again. "Mommy's here with you now, my darling. You have to be strong, sweetheart. We're almost there." Garrett drove in silence, but he took them straight to the best hospital he knew, and with his influence, he made certain the little girl was received and treated by the doctors immediately, without having to wait even a single second. The hours that followed were the longest and most tense hours imaginable. Della sat outside the emergency room, both hands clenched together, her eyes never leaving the closed door, praying in silence. Garrett sat beside her and didn't say much, but his steady presence became a quiet support that kept her from collapsing. She was used to facing every storm in life alone, and now, to have someone beside her in this terrifying moment felt strange and warm enough to make her throat ache. At last, after hours that seemed to stretch on forever, the doctor stepped out with a reassuring smile on his lips. "The child is out of danger now," he said. "It was a high fever caused by a viral infection. Fortunately, you brought her in on time. She'll need to rest and be monitored for a few more days, but you can be at ease. She'll recover completely." Della broke down crying, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief. When she was allowed in to see her daughter, Posey was awake again, her face still pale, but her eyes clear once more, and the little girl gave a weak smile when she saw her mother. Della bent down and held her child in her arms, feeling the normal warmth that had returned to her daughter's skin. And in that moment, she silently gave thanks for everything. But what neither she nor Garrett had foreseen was that this very appearance at the hospital had accidentally left behind a trace, and the dark shadow they were trying to hide from had now begun to find the trail. That night, in the quiet hospital room where there was only the steady sound of the heart monitor, Posey had fallen deeply asleep again, and her breathing was now gentle and normal. Della sat at the edge of the bed, one hand softly stroking her daughter's curly hair, her face finally easing after so many hours of tension. Garrett leaned against the window frame, silently watching mother and daughter, and in that rare peaceful moment, he spoke softly. "You know," he said, his voice low and quiet, "it's been a very long time since I've seen something worth protecting this much." Della looked up at him, and she gave a faint smile, tired but filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said. "You didn't have to do any of this, and yet you still did." Garrett only shook his head slightly, as though those thanks weren't necessary. In that quiet moment, between two people who each carried their own wounds, some invisible thread seemed to tighten between them, a silent bond they both felt but neither dared to name. And yet, that peace didn't last long, because on the very night Posey was brought into emergency care, a name had been entered into the hospital record system, and the tangled network of connections Calvin Brandt had spent years building in the medical world, through Dr. Pell himself, immediately discovered it. Della Marsh, the woman who had vanished without a trace, the woman he had believed had obediently lowered her head and stayed silent, had suddenly reappeared. When this news reached Calvin, his usual false calm instantly fell apart. He had already heard rumors that a file related to what his son had done had somehow reached federal agents, and now that woman had surfaced again. But what truly made that powerful man shiver with fear wasn't that. It was when his people found out that the person protecting Della was Garrett Vance. The moment that name was spoken, Calvin felt a cold current run down his spine. He was a man used to sitting at the height of power, used to everyone lowering themselves before him, and yet the name Vance alone was enough to make him lose his composure. He knew who Garrett was. He knew that Garrett was the only man in this city whom his money and connections couldn't bribe or threaten, a man who operated by laws of his own. Why is he involved in this? Calvin growled inside his luxurious office, sweat beading across his forehead. She's just some worthless little waitress. Why would Vance act on her behalf? Fear quickly turned into the desperate recklessness of a man being cornered. He understood that if that file were allowed to do its work, if that woman opened her mouth and spoke the truth, then the entire empire he had spent his life building would collapse into ruins. And so, in his desperation, Calvin Brandt made the cruelest and most mistaken decision of his life. He spent a large sum of money to hire a group of men who specialized in dirty work, ordering them to find Della's hiding place and take back whatever could destroy him. Garrett's predator's instinct told him that the storm was about to come crashing down. Immediately, the first thing he did was have Posey taken to another shelter, one that was absolutely safe and completely separate, so that no matter what happened, the little girl would never have to come even close to the danger drawing near. They came at midnight, when a thick fog covered the hillside completely. A line of cars with their lights turned off quietly crawled up the sloping road that led to the house, and from inside those cars, the men Calvin had hired stepped out, with Tyr Brandt at the front, his face filled with murderous intent, mixed with the impatience of someone desperate to erase every trace. But what they didn't know was that Garrett had seen this move coming long before. He hadn't sat still and waited. He had turned the entire hillside into his own ground. "Go inside and lock the door," he told Della, his voice strangely calm. "No matter what you hear, don't open it until I call your name." Della wanted to say something, but the steadiness in his eyes reassured her, and she obeyed. Calvin's men moved into the front yard, spreading out to surround the house, confident in their numbers. That was their first mistake. The darkness and the familiar terrain were Garrett's allies. The man in front had barely set foot on the steps when a cord already stretched in place snapped upward, and he went down hard, cleanly disabled before he could let out even a cry. Two others felt their way around to the back of the house, but Garrett's men, silent figures already lying in wait among the bushes, immediately overpowered them with swift precision, covering their mouths and tying them up. Panic began to spread through the remaining men when they realized their companions were vanishing one by one into the night without any warning. They fired wildly into the darkness, into the rustling bushes, wasting bullets uselessly on ghosts. Garrett moved through the fog like part of the darkness itself, making no unnecessary sound. He didn't want a bloody massacre. What he wanted was to plant terror and break their will. One by one, he isolated each man, separated them from the others, then brought them down with cold, exact precision. One terrified man threw away his gun and ran, shouting that this was a trap, that he wasn't about to die for old Brandt's money. And so, one by one, the men hired to deal with Della were either subdued and left scattered across the ground, or fled in panic down the hillside, abandoning the man who had led them there. Tyr Brandt was finally left alone in the yard, the gun in his hand trembling violently, cold sweat pouring down his face. He spun around again and again, pointing the gun into the darkness on every side, but saw nothing except the milky white fog and a terrifying silence. "Show yourself, you coward," he shouted, his voice already laced with fear he couldn't hide. "Who the hell are you to stand against the Brandt family?" A low voice sounded right behind him, as if it had been spoken by the night wind itself. "You like using your father's power to trample people weaker than you, don't you, Tyr?" Before he could turn around, the gun was knocked from his hand with one decisive movement, and in the next instant, he was thrown down onto the cold ground, completely pinned, with no strength left to resist. Garrett stepped out of the darkness, standing tall before the man who had caused all of Della's suffering. He didn't look angry. His face was calm in a way that chilled the blood, the calm of a man who knew justice was finally within reach. "Where's your father?" Garrett asked, his voice ice-cold. Tyr lay on the ground, gasping for breath. The arrogance that usually filled his eyes now replaced by absolute terror, tasting for the first time in his life the helplessness he had inflicted on so many others. Garrett could have done anything he wanted to the man who had caused so much suffering, but he didn't. He wasn't the kind of man who poured his rage through his fists onto someone who had already lost every ability to fight back, because he understood that some punishments were far heavier than wounds to the flesh. He only bent down, looked straight into Tyr's fear-soaked eyes, and let him taste the full weight of helplessness, the feeling of being stripped of every bit of power and protection, the very feeling he had once so cruelly forced upon Della and so many others. "You've gotten used to thinking your father's money can buy everything and shield you from every consequence," Garrett said, his voice even and cutting cold. "Now lie there and think about what you really are when the Brandt name is no longer behind you. Nothing but a pitiful coward." When dawn broke and the federal agents arrived at the scene to take custody of Calvin's men along with Tyr Brandt, everything seemed to have been settled. But Calvin still had his legal mask intact. He could still deny everything outright, still push all the blame onto his son and the hired men, still hire the best lawyers to turn himself into an innocent victim. The evidence Garrett had gathered was substantial, but it was still missing one final link that could tie Calvin himself directly to the crime. A statement from the person at the center of it all. And that link, more than anyone else, had to come from Della herself. When the federal agent came to speak with her, he made it clear that without her direct testimony, Calvin Brandt might very well slip through the net of the law once again. Della stood in silence for a long while. In that moment, all her old fears rushed back. The fear of losing her job, losing her home, the fear for her daughter's safety. She had once chosen to lower her head and remain silent because of those fears. She had once begged Marlowe not to speak the truth. But now, the woman standing there was no longer the trembling woman from 3 weeks ago. She thought of Posey, thought of the future she wanted to give her child, a future that didn't have to be lived in fear or with her head bowed before evil. She thought of all the other powerless people who were also being trampled and silenced, just as she had once been. Then she reached into her old wallet, felt down beneath the lining, where she had hidden the photograph all this time, right beneath the picture of her daughter. She pulled it out, the photograph Marlowe had given her, the photograph capturing the moment Tyr sprang to his feet right behind her on that fateful night. "I want to testify," she said, her voice quiet at first, then growing steadier with every word. "I've kept this since the first day, and I'll tell the whole truth about what happened. About how Tyr Brandt deliberately injured me, and about how Calvin Brandt used money and threats to silence me, to bribe the doctor, and alter the records. I won't stay silent for one more day." Her words were like the final rush of water breaking through a dam. Marlowe, the young assistant cook from that night, also stepped forward to stand beside her, clearly confirming that he had witnessed the entire incident with his own eyes, and was ready to testify. Della's courage passed to others like a flame, once they knew that someone had dared to stand up. The manager, Hewitt, and even Dr. Pell, both of whom had already been shaken, finally chose to tell the truth in order to save themselves instead of sinking with the Brandt family. One statement after another fitted together, and along with Della's photograph, they formed a complete and undeniable indictment, a chain binding Calvin Brandt tightly to the very crime he had worked so hard to conceal. The moment the woman whom the whole city had once turned away from finally raised her voice, no longer trembling, no longer afraid, was the moment the scales of justice tipped fully toward the truth. Garrett stood at a distance, watching her in silence, and in his eyes there was not only admiration, but also a belief confirmed that true strength didn't lie in power or money, but in the courage of a human being who dared to stand up and reclaim her own dignity. Della hadn't been saved by anyone. She had freed herself, but the greatest debt, the debt of 20 years, still hadn't been paid. A few days later, when the Brandt Empire had begun to shake at its very foundations beneath the weight of testimony and evidence, Garrett went to see Calvin Brandt one final time, face to face. By then, Calvin was a cornered man, but he still tried to hold on to the last scraps of his pride. "What do you want?" he growled. "Money? Power? I can give you everything, if you help me get out of this." Garrett didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly drew something from his coat pocket and placed it on the table in front of Calvin. It was the old pocket watch, its silver case tarnished and scratched, its glass cracked at one corner. Calvin frowned at it, not understanding at first. But then, as a distant memory slowly rose back to the surface, his face began to change. "Do you remember a woman who worked herself to exhaustion in your laundry workshop 20 years ago?" Garrett asked, his voice trembling for the first time with an emotion held back for far too long. "A woman whose hands cracked from hot water and chemicals. A woman who fell ill because of that very work, and whom you threw into the street without mercy when she was no longer useful to you. She was my mother, and this watch was the only thing she left me before she died." Calvin went deathly still. All the arrogance on his face shattered, giving way to a primal terror as he realized that the man standing before him, the man who had brought his entire world crashing down, wasn't some random opponent, but the ghost of a crime he had committed and forgotten 20 years ago. "For 20 years, I waited for this day," Garrett continued, his voice once again calm in a frightening way. "But I don't need to destroy you with my own hands, Calvin. Your own greed and cruelty dug the grave you're standing in. You could have lived peacefully with your secrets if you hadn't reached out with that cruel hand of yours once again to crush another mother, another powerless woman. And this time, she wasn't alone." With that, Garrett picked up the watch again, turned, and walked away, leaving Calvin Brandt sitting there alone amid the ashes of the empire he had traded his soul to build. waiting for the sentence that justice would give him. The Brandt family's empire, which had once seemed solid and untouchable, finally collapsed completely, not because of a bullet or a purge carried out in the dark, but because of the light of truth and justice itself. Calvin Brandt had to face a series of serious charges, and lost both the fortune and the reputation he had spent his entire life building. Tyr Brandt paid for his crime with a fitting sentence under the law, tasting for the first time in his life the consequences his father's money couldn't buy away. Dr. Pell was permanently stripped of his medical license for selling his conscience and falsifying records, while the manager Hewitt also received the punishment he deserved for his cowardice and complicity. The city of Halloran, which had once closed its eyes and looked away, was now forced to stare directly at the truth it had deliberately buried for so long. But the most beautiful thing wasn't the fall of the wicked. It was the rebirth of a human being. A few months later, on a quiet little street, a charming bakery opened its doors, with bright glass windows and warm yellow light spilling out every morning, always fragrant with the rich scent of butter and sugar. It was Della's own bakery, not a gift handed to her by anyone, but the result of what she had built with her own 2 hands. The hands that had once been wounded, the hands that had once been unable to straighten, now healed and whole again. On the morning of the grand opening, Della stood behind the counter, kneading the first batch of dough, and for the first time after everything she had endured, she held the tray of dough firmly in her hands without feeling even a trace of pain. She gently stretched her arm out straight, looked at it beneath the morning sunlight, and a happy tear rolled down her cheek. Posey rushed in, her healthy face glowing, crying out that she wanted to be the first person to taste the cookies, just as her mother had promised long ago, and Della laughed, lifting the little girl into her arms, feeling the fullness of the simple happiness she had once believed she had lost forever. In a quiet corner of the bakery, Garrett sat silently, sipping a cup of coffee, watching mother and daughter with a rare smile at the corners of his eyes. He didn't say much, and he didn't need to, because between him and Della there was now a strong bond built from understanding and respect, a warm affection that didn't need to be displayed loudly, yet was still enough to warm the old wounds of 2 people who had once been lonely. Della's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that the silence and indifference of the crowd in the face of another person's pain can sometimes be the very thing that helps evil run free, and that a person's dignity has never been decided by whether they're rich or poor, but by whether someone is kind enough to look directly at their suffering and treat them as a real human being. Sometimes, what a suffering person needs most isn't pity, but simply to be heard and to be seen. If the story of Della's journey to reclaim her dignity and light has touched your heart, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you many meaningful and compelling stories every day. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love to spread this message of kindness. How do you feel about this story? Which character left the deepest emotion in your heart? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the honest feelings from deep inside your heart. We wish everyone listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness filling each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.